Here is how to set up escalations in Jira Service Management. Now, the first thing we're going to do is open up a JSM project in my Jira environment. So I'll make sure to select that project type and then head over to IT support, which is the one I'm going to be using for the example today. Now, there's really three parts to setting this up. Number one, we need a way to trigger and start this escalation process. Number two, we need to provide context and notify the person that it's getting escalated to. And number three, we need to be able to track all the current escalations, where they're at, and what's happening with them. So let's go over step number one first. We need to make sure that we have a way to actually trigger an escalation. And the way we do this is by going to our space settings. We'll go to our workflows. There should be a workflows tab. And in here, we're going to need to edit a workflow, or what I like to do instead is actually just duplicate a workflow first and then edit it. That way there's nothing being changed in the live environment. So what I'll do is, let's say I'm going to be setting up an escalation for this incident. And let me make sure there's no escalation in there now. Perfect, there is not. And let's go ahead and just copy over this name. So I'm just gonna select this, copy. I'll go to settings and then go to settings on the top right and go to my work items. And then we'll go over to our workflows. You don't necessarily have to do this, but it does make it a little bit easier for us to have sort of a version 1, version 2, and then apply the version 2 and leave the other one as a backup in case we need it. So active workflow, we found this one because I pasted in the name, and then I'll just click the three dots on the right side, hit copy, and then I'll just remove this prefix, and then I'll just say 2.0. I like to do this because it gives me a really good, clear indicator of which version this is, which one's newer, which one's older. So let's click on copy, and now we have our copied workflow that we can make any change to without breaking anything in production. Fantastic. So the first thing we're gonna do is add a new status. And you can use a status called escalate. That's the most common one. You can call this something else. I would probably recommend leaving this as escalate. That's kind of the default terminology used in Jira and with most teams and companies, but you can really make this to whatever you'd like it to be. So I should have one called escalated here already. If you don't, click on create new, give it a name, and then click add. Now we have our status, but we need to add transitions to our status to make sure that we can actually escalate something. And I'm gonna keep this very simple. You can kind of get a little bit more creative with this, but definitely don't allow everything to be escalated or all statuses to allow escalations. For example, if something is open, typically it's gonna go through like a tier 1 first before we actually escalate it. So I will go into escalated from work in progress. So I'll just click on it, grab the little circle, add and drag and drop the transition. And then I'll give this transition a name, call it escalation, start escalation, click create. And now we could start our escalation from work in progress. I'm gonna do the same thing from pending because that can also happen fairly often. And I will name this one, actually I should be able to reuse a transition. Let's see, drag, drop, nope, that's not the one I need. Or maybe I do need to rename it. Okay, start escalation. Let's see if it allows me to do this. There we go, okay, perfect. So we named this the same thing, and we could also make changes to this actual transition, all of them at the same time if we need to. So with both of the in progress type statuses, we can now escalate a work item. Now, what we can also add is the exits from escalation. So let's say we escalated something and it's done, it needs to be de-escalated. We need to send it back into work in progress. So I'll drop a transition and name this escalation completed and click create. And now we have a way to escalate and de-escalate. One more status that I would probably add here, or transition that I would add here, is to completed. That way we have a way to complete from escalated in case another agent does resolve this. So I'll do the same exact thing, completed, and give this a name, escalation completed. And then same thing for canceled, just in case this gets canceled. Maybe the requester just says this isn't really relevant anymore or necessary. We can drag and drop, and then we could name the status as canceled. Okay, there we go. So we have a way to actually escalate something now and to de-escalate something. So that's our status, and I'll show you how to actually bundle this into a queue. That way you can see all the escalated work items in just a moment. But the second piece that we need is we need to make sure that the context for the escalation is actually provided. And there's a couple of ways of going about this. One of those ways is by adding a screen. And by adding a screen, you could either require comments, you can essentially allow an assignee to be changed, you could do a few other various things. And I would use this option if you have an escalation that is going to be someone different every single time. For example, you have a tier 1 agent and maybe you have like 5 different people that this could get escalated to. Each of those people is sort of like a different domain owner. Maybe one's a security admin, maybe one's a infrastructure admin, maybe one is something else entirely. And depending on what type of work item it is, it'll need to go to a unique person determined by the agent who's escalating it. In that scenario, I would absolutely suggest having a screen. How do we add a screen? So all we have to do is request an input. We'll open up that little item and make sure that we're selecting the correct transition. So in this case, it's starting the escalation. We'll click the little drop down for request input, and we will add a request input rule. And all we're gonna do is show a screen, click select, and you do have to have a screen already created. If you do not, I'll show you how to do that really quick. And all we have to do is, again, click on the settings on the top right, go to your work items, and here on the sidebar, you will see an option for screens. We could add a new screen, and I will name this Escalation Screen, and I'll click add. Now all I have to do is search for it, and when I click on it, I could add whatever fields I want to show here. So in this case, I want to show the assignee, and I might want to show a comment as well. So this is option 1. We created the screen. We're going to show the assignee field, the comments field. That way, when anything actually gets escalated, we're going to be opted to fill out those 2 fields. And the way we apply this is just by, let me update this and refresh so that I could pull that new screen that I just created. And we're going to go back through request input, show a screen, select, and find our escalation screen that we just created. There we go. We've applied our screen. All we have to do is update our workflow. And now we have our workflow created that allows us to create an escalation that suggests or wants to request information from whoever is actually applying that escalation or running that escalation with an assignee and a comment. And then when we de-escalate, we have an option just to go back to in progress, to cancel, or to complete. So this is kind of a general outline. If you do not have a separate person that you're escalating to, if it's not unique, if it's always going to be escalated to the same person, I would actually not request an input. I would just run an automation or perform an action to assign a work item to somebody else. So if you're always escalating to Bob, just go to the assign a work item, select, and find the person who you want to escalate to, and you're done. That way you don't have to prompt someone every single time to select Bob if it's always going to be Bob. So just a little pointer there to reduce some of that friction in your workflows in the future. So there's our escalation workflow. All we have to do is apply this now. So let's close this out and let's head back to our Jira project, and we'll go back to our space settings. And what we're going to do is go to our workflows and replace the old incident workflow with the new one. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this name over, and then I'm going to add a workflow, add existing, and I'm going to Command F and search for it. We'll find 2.0. We'll click next. We will select just incidents since that's the one we want to replace. Click finish. And now we should have our updated workflow applied to our incidents. And we can see the 2.0 here, and we could publish this to make it official. So we'll associate this. This really shouldn't change much because we're not migrating anything. Nothing actually changed in terms of statuses. We just added one. So let's go ahead and test this out just to make sure that it actually works as we intended. So we'll click create. I'll make sure that this is an incident. I'll call this a test, and we'll click create. And once that's created, we will view this, and let's go ahead and see if our escalation actually works as intended. So as we set this up, we cannot escalate from an open status. So let's go ahead and start to go to work in progress, and we can hit investigate. There we go. And now if I click the drop down, we have an option to start an escalation. Fantastic. Now let's make sure that when we click on this, we have our fields showing up to request certain information. So I click on that, and now we're in Escalated, and it looks like our screen did not show up. We might have to go through some troubleshooting to make sure that it was set up correctly. So let's go back into our space settings. It happens all the time. This is why we're testing this out. So space settings, back into workflows. I might have missed one of them when setting this up. So let's just open up, and this time I won't copy anything over because we're just making a couple of minor changes to transitions. So start escalation, aha, there we go. So looks like I only added it to one of them. And what I did wrong here was actually split these up into separate transitions rather than having them as one transition. So what I'll do here is when I go into the escalated status, I'll add a from work in progress. There we go. And now there's one that's conflicting. And I'll just delete that entire status transition. There we go. And make sure that the other one is added. Perfect. So now we have a path from pending and from work in progress going to escalated. And now this is the same path rather than having two separate paths where we have to set up two different request input rules. And it just makes everything easier when we want to tweak this in the future. So now I'll update this. Let's go ahead and close this out, go back to our work item and test this out one more time to actually make sure that it's working. So let's go in here, let's send it back into in progress, and let's see if we have that field or screen popping up. Perfect. So we can now select an assignee, which is what we're prompted to do, and add a comment on why this was escalated. And then we could go ahead and start the escalation. And now the context was actually added. That way, when we pull this information over to the escalated team member, it's not just assigned directly to them. They jump in and they don't really know what's going on. They actually have that context available to them on why this was escalated. And as you can see, this is an internal note, so it's not actually shown to the customer. So there is our way to actually trigger the escalation, provide context on the escalation, but how do we track things that are all currently escalated? So let's say you wanted to see at any given time a group or a field or a list of work items that are currently in escalation. Well, to do that, all we have to do is build a queue. So let's go to view all queues. And I will go ahead and create a new one by going to queue settings instead. That's changed a little bit. And then we will create a new queue and I'll just call this escalations. All right. And then, oh, that's selecting a priority queue. There we go. We're escalated. And then all we're going to do is filter down our statuses to escalated. And that's it. It's that simple. So we'll go to the status dropdown and we'll make sure that escalated is selected. You could also make sure that it's unresolved, which should be a default. But now we'll get a queue that only shows us escalated work items. We could click create, and now this queue will show up inside of our queue list. And if I click on it and I go in here, I can now see all of my escalated work items in one singular place. And if I make sure, just to make sure that this works, I'll go ahead and complete this and we'll head back to the queue and it should disappear in just 1 second to actually clean up this queue and only show me what actually is escalated. Let me refresh to speed this up. There we go. Now this queue is empty because still not empty. Give it 1 more second. Probably some kind of a bug here, but this should move out of the queue very, very shortly. Actually, maybe there's something wrong with the queue settings. Let me go into the queue settings. Escalated, edit queue. And let me look at the JQL. Resolution equals unresolved and status equals escalated. Okay, looks like it was in fact a bug. It should be disappearing in a second here. Still showing up. Okay, let me try and close this out instead. See if that changes anything. Looks like there was a small bug, but we now have a queue that actively shows me what is escalated if I wanted to see that in one place. Now, a couple of things as I wrap this up that I see a lot of people making with escalation workflows and setups inside of Jira. And number one is just getting way too complicated with transitions, with statuses, with automations, and all that kind of stuff. Keep it very simple. Have one status for an escalation, have one queue for an escalation, have a screen for an escalation, or just an automation or two, and that's it. Don't really need much else. If you start getting very complicated with this, it becomes very hard to manage, and then it becomes very hard to fix when something actually breaks. There are use cases where escalations have to get a little bit more complex. That being said, if you can keep it simple, keep it simple. Number two is allowing escalations for all of your work types. And what I actually did here with the incidents was probably not a good idea. You generally do not want to escalate incidents. So make sure you're only allowing escalations for work types that need them. A system change, for example, or service request might need an escalation, whereas an incident or an employee setup, those don't really make sense to include an escalation. So if those are separate workflows, do not add them there since they don't need to be in those actual workflows and confusing people on what an escalation is, what it'll do in that scenario. So just keep it cleaner if you can. And number three is not including a de-escalation process. The whole goal of an escalation is to send something to someone who is a higher value or a more senior team member, which typically costs more for the company. And when you don't have a de-escalation option, so you're sending something over to a senior rep, which costs the company more, we want them to be able to solve the problem and then send it back to the more junior agent or the tier 1 support to wrap it up. If we don't have that de-escalation option, you end up eating more of the time of the senior rep. So make sure you always have a way to de-escalate, send it back to in progress, send it back to another rep. This could be as simple as just allowing a reassign and then going into a in progress type status. So make sure that a de-escalation is actually possible. And then number 4 is not including any context, which is why we set up the screen with a comment. Make sure that there's context when an escalation happens. This is probably a little bit more cultural, but make sure that when your team does run an escalation, there is some context as to why it was escalated. That way, there doesn't have to be more back and forth for the more senior rep to figure out what's actually going on. And number 5 is defining a de-escalation criteria, just making sure that you have a way to decipher and tell when something is actually done within an escalation and can be de-escalated. Otherwise, a more senior rep might just tweak a couple of things, send it back, and then it'll have to go through those loops multiple times. So have a little bit more of a criteria of when something is actually de-escalated. So I hope this helped. And if you need help setting up your own escalations, feel free to check the link in the description below to book a strategy session with my team, and we can help you out.